Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Democracy Unmoored, Populism and the Corruption of Popular Sovereignty by Samuel Issacharoff. Read by Stephen Caffrey. Publisher's note: this audiobook contains references to visuals present in the print and e-book editions of the book. Introduction. The Populist Challenge. About a decade ago, I found myself alone for dinner one evening in Buenos Aires, the city of my birth. I had a lecture to give the next day, and I had reserved the time alone to prepare over dinner in a typical neighborhood restaurant. Such a boliche, in the local porteño slang, was a comfortable setting to have a meal. I sat down to enjoy typical Argentine fare and the inescapable good wine, and turned to my lecture materials. I soon found myself distracted by an excellent soccer match shown on a large-screen TV that had been brought in for the occasion. A couple of glasses of tinto, the Reds of Mendoza Province, and a close football game, and I accepted that lecture preparation was concluded. This was no doubt the best of Argentina: steak, wine, and football. I sat and allowed my thoughts to run to what might have been. What if I had not emigrated to the United States as a young boy? Would I have survived the dirty war of military repression that landed so heavily on my generation? Would I have achieved what became possible in emigration amid the constant economic and political disruptions? But also, would I appreciate the aspects of life in Buenos Aires that are still so alluring to the outside visitor? Periodically, I would be drawn from the comfortable domain of steak, wine, and football to return to another reality of Argentina, one that well illustrates the central framework of this book. Every few minutes, an announcer would garishly proclaim that the football match was part of La Copa Kirchner. La Copa Kirchner? I had been engrossed in match play, and was suddenly thrust back into the reality of Argentine politics. The national championship had been renamed in 2011 for Néstor Kirchner, the former president of Argentina, who died the year before. In itself, there is nothing striking about the country honoring a deceased head of state. In the U.S., we think nothing of naming cities, airports, bridges, sporting events, holidays, even clearance sales after our former presidents or other significant figures in our history. But the Argentine story was more complicated. Back in 2007, Néstor decided to forego a run for re-election. But the claim to a legacy continued. Instead, he was succeeded as candidate to the presidency by his wife, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. Cristina, known widely as CFK, proved a strong candidate and became president. Again, not remarkable. In the U.S., we have had families of the Adamses, Harrisons, Roosevelts, and Bushes follow in electoral successes. What was distinct was that I was watching the Copa Kirchner in the run-up to the presidential election of 2012, in which CFK was running for re-election. Joy over a perfect Argentine evening quickly turned to deeper concern during the match's halftime. Instead of the usual sports commentary, the entire halftime show was a tribute to the wise and courageous leadership of Néstor Kirchner, a sign of the ongoing Argentine trauma of Peronism. To the untrained eye of a foreigner stumbling upon this spectacle, the tribute might have appeared as bordering on election propaganda for the incumbent president as successor to the Kirchner legacy. To the more discerning eye, there could be no ambiguity. The government had hijacked the most important domestic sports event to brand it as its own. It was as if a sitting president in the U.S. renamed the Super Bowl as a family tribute. La Copa Kirchner was hardly an isolated event in the process of government ingratiation with its base. In 2009, the Argentine government, under Cristina Kirchner, had nationalized the cable television stations that broadcast football matches in Argentina, the Fútbol para Todos, Soccer for All program, with the indisputable claim that soccer was the birthright of all Argentines. So by the time of the first broadcast of the Copa Kirchner, there was no doubt of the mass audience for the halftime tribute to Kirchner's legacy as president. A leading Argentine newspaper, La Nación, prompted a scandal by estimating that the Fútbol para Todos program amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars of free publicity for the incumbent Peronist ticket of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. Undeterred, the government then decreed that poorer Argentines may have need for new digital televisions to take advantage of the largesse, and then, only months before the 2012 presidential elections, decreed a new TVs for All program that subsidized purchases of new model televisions. Government largesse in an election year knew no bounds. It turned out that football was not the only legacy that the Kirchner administration could bestow on all Argentines. For the poor, suddenly there were the Beef for All subsidies inaugurated during the election year, and that was followed by the Dairy Products for All campaign. And to top it off, the program that in translation captures it all, the Pork for All initiative. Putting aside my reflections of the evening, as scheduled, I continued the next day to give a lecture to the Argentine Society of International Law on the use of drones and the legal dimensions of war against non-state actors. That was the consuming issue of the day for the U.S. and the Obama administration, and one that engaged much of my thinking. But the image of the halftime political tribute in the midst of an election campaign tugged at me. What are the limits of the use of executive power in a democracy? How can democracy ensure electoral accountability in the increasing world of executive domination? What happens when the executive dominates the legislature through partisan alignment, as argued in the American context by my colleagues Darrell Levinson and Richard Piltis, or simply through the accretion of unilateral administrative authority? Upon further reflection, I realized that this was not a new question for me. Encountering the use of great executive power to tilt the playing field of what remained formally an electoral democracy was an ongoing feature of the 21st century. I had dramatically encountered a similar set of issues only a few years earlier. In 2006, on the eve of Hugo Chávez's re-election as president of Venezuela, I found myself sneaking into a hotel room in Caracas for a meeting with the heads of the major opposition newspapers and television stations. I was in Venezuela to give some lectures on freedom of the press at the invitation of the State Department, a challenging tour given the virulent anti-Americanism of the regime. By the time I got to this hotel room, a newspaper site I was supposed to speak at had been blown up the night before, and things had been thrown in my face while lecturing at the University of Caracas. But that hotel meeting allowed me to understand the new world of incipient authoritarianism. Would-be autocrats around the world no longer relied on the detention camps, the tanks in the street, the machine gun in the hands of soldiers on the street corner. What Venezuela rolled out, the Chávez playbook, was a new form of repression within the law, substituting intralegal abuse for the crude human rights abuses of yesteryear. The independent media of Venezuela described a world that today seems almost routine. Vilification of the press, accusations of faking the news, and claims of being foreign agents were the first layer of an increasingly charged information environment. Pro-government publishers found themselves with privileged access to state information and interviews. Government public service advertisements, doled out on a strictly partisan basis, provided a blatant subsidy for Chavez-friendly newspapers' views. Demands for government access, for part-time presidential discourses, La Hora del Comandante, cut into important advertising time for networks, threatening their financial viability. For the pro-government media, lavish state buys were ready substitutes. For the less servile, the bottom-line consequences were severe. Most unexpected, however, was the answer to my question of the most immediate threat to journalistic independence. For the newspaper editor, directly next to me, the answer came quickly. He recounted dozens of defamation suits, brought directly or indirectly by the government as a result of his newspaper's articles and editorials. Even more surprising was the burst of laughter from the other 15 people in the room. I was stunned. I protested that they must understand the tremendous resources of time, money, and will that would be necessary to defend one's integrity against repeated legal processes. They then made clear that I had no idea why they were laughing. In turn, they each recounted the defamation suits filed against them. The first to speak had almost 100. Then the numbers piled up with each successive speaker. By the time the director of the leading all-news station spoke, the numbers were astronomical. This one brave journalistic leader reported over 5,000 defamation actions against him. They had laughed at the first speaker, not because this was not a huge attempt to silence dissent, but because of the relatively modest number of lawsuits that the first journalist had encountered thus far. While the confrontation with the growing illiberalism of the Chavez regime was arresting, I could not help but be aware we were meeting up in the hills of East Caracas, the wealthier precincts of that divided city, near the Caracas Country Club, long the bastion of Venezuelan privilege. The attempt to silence critics through the instrumentalities of law and the state captured the disregard for democracy of the Chavez regime, but it could not explain the regime's solid base of support. The leafy neighborhoods of East Caracas, as well as the institutions of culture and free expression that were nurtured there, coexisted with wrenching poverty and one of the worst inequalities of wealth among any nation on earth. By the end of the 20th century, Venezuela was the richest nation in all of Latin America, a resounding success story, not only economically, but also based on its status as a strong, uninterrupted democracy which stood out compared to its neighbors. Unfortunately, as is the fate that befalls countries relying on extractive industries, a subsequent drop in oil prices doomed Venezuela. Moises Naim, Venezuela's Minister of Trade and Industry from 1989 to 1999, observed in 2001, "The disappearance of the party system that dominated Venezuelan politics for more than 4 decades was not a sudden Soviet-style collapse resulting from an excess concentration of power in the hands of a small clique of politicians. In fact, Chavez's ascendancy owes more to long-term dilution of the political power once held by Acción Democrática and COPI, Venezuela's 2 main political parties. Indeed, from Naim's vantage, the policy package that exacerbated inequality in the mid-1990s represented 2 factors. First, entrenched political actors becoming detached from local forces like labor unions, and second, a full-scale capitulation to anti-elite sentiment. During this period, the 2 political parties that were building blocks of Venezuelan democracy for more than 5 decades lost almost all their influence, as did the country's business, labor, and intellectual elites. A new set of hitherto unknown political actors emerged, along with new rules of the game. Elections and referenda proliferated, with voters going to the polls 5 times in 18 months during 1999 and 2000. The following day rounded out the picture of the popular support that would lead Chavez to re-election. I was flying back to the U.S., but a tropical downpour and a mudslide had taken out the modern highway bridge that connected downtown to the airport. Instead, I had to cross over the old road in the hills above the city, a poorly paved two-lane road that ran through the precarious villages and shanty towns that invariably surround Latin American capitals. Amid the poverty and the signs of gang domination stood out one feature that I had not seen before. In just about every hamlet, there was a spotless brown hexagonal building in the main square or intersection, in perfect repair and freshly painted. Each of those small but distinct buildings was a health clinic, provided for and staffed by the Cuban government. Exporting medical services was no doubt a propaganda effort by Cuba, intended to shore up an ally in Latin America. But who cares? This was a medical service for people living in pretty desperate conditions. If access to health services cemented support for Chavez among the laboring poor, it was hard to see this as other than an indictment of the elites who had so long ruled Venezuela and used the accumulated oil wealth in ways that left so much of the population at risk. Political gain for the regime? No doubt. But no one can claim that the U.S. creation of Medicare and Medicaid, or the extension of prescription drug coverage, or the insurance protection of pre-existing medical conditions did not redound to the political effect of each president who brought new health protections to the voters. Health services in poor regions are only the beginning of the story. In order to cement their electoral base, populist leaders redirected important resources to the poorest parts of the population. For Venezuela, the source was oil revenue. For other populist leaders in the region, such as President Rafael Correa of Ecuador or the Kirchners of Argentina, the gains from the commodity boom of the 2000s permitted genuine redistribution and attention to the neglected sectors of society. As expressed by advisors to the current Argentine regime, "We're putting meat on the grill for those who put us in power. The debt can wait." But the cost was a massive expansion of the state sector and the consolidation of economic power in the service of a personalist political agenda. When the oil market became glutted, or the seemingly insatiable Chinese demand for soy and other commodities slackened, then suddenly these populist regimes stood exposed amid scandal and insolvency. Latin America went through this cycle first, but now the same question of how democracy operates in the face of immediate demands of populism confronts the entire democratic world. These personal observations set the foundation for this book. The inquiry begins with the simple observation that democracy today is under siege, but from a source that could hardly have been imagined in the world before the fall of the Berlin Wall. For much of the 20th century, the existential threat to democracy was authoritarian rule. The modern language of human rights was born to thwart the usage of state authority in bending the population to the will of the rulers. Human rights defined the inalienability of an irreducible core of human dignity. The rights holder was the individual at risk. In turn, this rights discourse became the lingua franca of the empowered judiciary that took hold in Europe after World War II, and then across so much of the world in the post-1989 third wave of democratization. The 20th century closed with a certain vision of market-based liberal democracy triumphant against its ideological rivals of fascism and communism. The imprecise contours of ascendant democracy included generally robust markets, welfare as protection for citizens, a broad commitment to secularism, even in countries with an established church, and liberal tolerance of dissent and rival political organizations. All this was packaged in robust constitutional protections of civil liberties and the integrity of the political order, and, characteristic of the era, all was under the supervision of increasingly commanding constitutional courts or other apex tribunals. These features were sufficiently widespread that a great deal of imprecision could be accepted in the exact pedigree of this new world order. It was the ascendancy of both democracy and of constitutionalism. It represented the triumph of liberalism and the realization of the Enlightenment project. It was both the vindication of capitalism and the realization of the state of social welfare, precisely because it seemed to be all at once the conflict between majoritarian politics and constitutional restraint, between the creative destruction of markets and social guarantees, between liberty and security, all could be pushed aside. The fall of the Soviet Empire was the crowning achievement of the post-war democratic order. Yet, the triumphant era of what Samuel Huntington termed the third wave of democracy would not last much into the new millennium. The democratic euphoria following the fall of the Berlin Wall barely ran its course before it confronted a new, virulent reaction to the new modern imperium. In short order, Islamic-inspired terror introduced a malevolent new international actor. The Arab Spring collapsed into familiar patterns of tyranny or, as in Syria, violent communal strife. By the early 2000s, a number of newly minted democracies were retreating to customary forms of autocratic rule. But the biggest shocks came not from the periphery, but from within the established democratic order. These shocks were not the product of military conflict or attempts at violent overthrow, but were instead largely promoted by economic insecurity and the changing demographics of a globalized world. Populist upsurges from right and left revealed the disrepair of the post-World War II general consensus of politics in the democratic world. From France to India, the historic parties such as Congress, the Socialists, and the Gaullists were discredited and effectively pushed outside the political order. Brexit prevailed over strenuous opposition from within both the Tories and Labour. The American presidential election of 2016 featured a determined Democratic run by Bernie Sanders, not even a member of that party, and the eventual victory by President Trump, a candidate with only fleeting relations to the Republican Party. The new political challenge saw democracy not as the culmination of the post-war era, but as a failed elite endeavor that had left the laboring classes vulnerable. Populist leaders from left and right learned to bypass institutionalized forms of politics in favor of direct and frequent communications with the population, from Hugo Chavez's frequent multi-hour television appearances to Donald Trump's infatuation with Twitter. Even before the dramatic assault on the U.S. Capitol in the waning hours of the Trump presidency, ascendant populism had made clear its rejection of the foundations of modern democratic governance. The secret to democratic stability is repeat play, which requires an extended time horizon. Time allows the losers of today the prospect of reorganizing and emerging as the winners of tomorrow. An election may yield a bad result. The tenor of the era may prompt poor legislation. But what remains critical is the capacity to recover. The American experiment in democratic self-rule was consolidated in the election of 1800, which represented for the first time a head of state that had been removed through electoral means. In his wide-eyed review of American democracy, de Tocqueville thought that the key to non-aristocratic rule was the capacity to make what he termed retrievable mistakes. At the time, he assumed that the challenge to successful democratic governance would be military intercession, as with the disastrous War of 1812. that would shorten the time horizon needed for Republican prospects. The constricting force today is not external but internal, notwithstanding the continuing threat of terrorism and the reorganization of international relations in light of Chinese ascendancy. Populist impulses shorten the time frame of relevant political consequences and turn everything into a bimodal choice, a political life defined by existential issues. Us or them, success or perfidy, the people or the oligarchs, our nation or foreigners. There can be no spirit of partial victory, a legitimate disagreement, or even a mutual gain through engagement. The effects of compressed time horizons can be seen in the willingness to discard long-standing institutional rules that protect the minority, such as the Senate filibuster in the U.S., in favor of immediate political gain. Efforts to alter election rules or the powers held by elected governments, as shown in the American context in North Carolina or Wisconsin, are perhaps the most combustible manifestation of the current challenge to the necessary long horizon of stable democratic governance. The stable democracies pass from being a challenge among adversaries to an unyielding battle against enemies. To borrow from Michael Ignatieff, democratic politics, under the sway of populism, loses the sense of collective enterprise among all political actors. Not only does the commitment to repeat play drop out, but so does the limitation on what the victors can expect to do. Modern democracies govern through institutional arrangements that run the gamut from separation of powers at the formal level of the state to the private associations that provide stability and continuity over time, most notably the political parties that undergird a stable political order. Populism, noted Isaiah Berlin a half-century ago, is not principally interested in political institutions, although it is prepared to use the state as an instrument for the purpose of producing its ends. But a state organization is not its aim, and the state is not its ideal human association. It believes in society rather than in the state. All these movements believe in some kind of moral regeneration. There must have been a spiritual fall somewhere. Either the fall is in the past or it is threatening, one of the two. Either innocence has been lost and some kind of perversion of men's nature has occurred, or enemies are breeding within or attacking from without. This book will largely follow Berlin's diagnosis of populism as being grounded in political mobilization in disregard of the institutions of governance. Much has been written on the economic preconditions for the current populist surge, and the role of failing economic fortunes in prompting a backlash in politics, particularly in the face of immigration. Others have focused on the role of social media in allowing mass incitement outside the boundaries of established political institutions. Many ground the investigation in the particulars of a single country. Others, most notably Jan Werner Müller, look to the clientelism and demagogy that are characteristic of populist leaders. Each of these approaches captures an important strain of the nature of populism and its threat to democratic governance. For present purposes, however, the striking feature is the anti-institutionalism of populism, both as a political movement and as a governance strategy. The attack on Congress's ceremonial function of counting the electoral votes for president is both symbol and substance of the war on the inherited forms of governance. In the assault of the immediate, democratic institutional arrangements are particularly vulnerable. Populist elections claim a mandate from the people that goes beyond choosing office holders. Election over mandates risk the same repudiation of institutional accommodation of divisions as do plebiscites. It is not that populism is plebiscitary as such. Rather, Neither is well suited to institutionalized politics that presume deliberation.
Sample complete.